Alright, sorry for the late response, folks. I've been very busy. Now, Beatmasterfield did send me his response to my arguments against his claims. So this is my final rebuttal, and after this, we'll be giving our closing arguments simultaneously. So this is my response to his response, my final rebuttal here, besides my closing argument. Now, it's not going to be as fancy as the last one. As you can see, it's very crude. Alright, so I apologize for the audio quality, but I wanted to get this done as soon as possible, and I didn't want it to take up as much time as last time. Last time was like more than an hour long, with 60 slides. Alright, this one only has about 15 slides, and according to my test run is only about 20 minutes, so let's get into it. This here is the top 6 mistakes in his arguments. These are the top 6 mistakes in both his responses and his arguments. Now this time, he did give me some actual syllogisms for his claims. Last time I didn't have any access to syllogisms, now I do. So here you can see the variables of a syllogism, A and B and C. A and B are basically the objective ground and ultimate objective ground. Alright, ultimate objective ground is kind of new. It wasn't seen in the last video, so I knew I was missing something. But here it is. And C. Variable C are the consequences if we don't accept A and B, basically. Unless we had this objective ground or A objective ground, anything goes, and these are the consequences of anything goes. And here's the actual syllogism that he provided. It is valid. I know a few of the premises may be off a little bit. I mean, as in they're in the wrong order, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it's still valid for me. It's good enough. It's just as valid as the last one. I mean, seriously, all you do is switch around a few premises, so there's no reason for me to criticize the argument as invalid just because a few premises are mixed-matched. It's a perfectly valid argument, and it's actually quite rare that I get an argument like this in this type of debate, so I'm very glad that I have a high-quality debate here. So this is the syllogism, and it looks pretty solid. It looks pretty solid, except there is one part of this syllogism that has a major weakness. Otherwise, everything else is pretty nice. So I will say that this is one of the nicest arguments I've ever seen for this position. Usually I don't get a whole lot of nice arguments, so I'm glad I got one. And I'm glad I got one that's more of a challenge. But that being said, there are some serious flaws in this argument. So I'm going to go ahead and address those. In fact, there are 6 of them, and they're all in the same place. This argument has one specific weakness. One part of this argument is a weak link. And that weak link happens to be premise 3. Premise 3 is where all the trouble starts happening. Premise 3 is the source of all the trouble in this argument. And the first mistake, the first problem is that it's a false premise. Now, if you go back, what he's saying here with premise 3 is basically there's this relationship that exists. You can see in P1 and P2. And the label we use to describe this relationship is marriage. Alright, you know, and he actually sent me another private message with, explaining basically how this works. You guys probably know about it. You see a cylinder in the woods, and it's made of wood, it has leaves growing in it. You label it a tree. Well, that's basically what we're doing here. We see this relationship in nature, and we label it marriage. That is the third premise. Well, the problem is that's not what we use to label that relationship. I mean, it's heterosexuality. That's the correct label. So how do we know premise 3 is false? What evidence do I have that it's false? Why do I think it's false? Well, first evidence is something you can all look at. You can look at marriage contracts. Alright, either you're married. If you're married, you can look at marriage contracts. If your parents are married, you can look at theirs. If you're, for example, in the state of Maryland, gay or straight, you can get a marriage contract. I do apologize for those of you who can't. Unfortunately, that is sad, but you can still look at marriage contracts from another person. You can see that according to the contract, you don't have to have sex, heterosexual sex. You don't have to procreate or even have the potential to procreate. In other words, you could be a completely sterile couple without any genitals. You can have a sterile couple with no genitals at all. They're not going to be able to have sex. They will not have sex. They will not procreate, and they don't even have the potential to naturally procreate. Yet they will not breach their marriage contracts. They will still be allowed to get a marriage contract and get a marriage license. They will still be allowed to get married. So again, look at the marriage contract. What does the contract say marriage describes? It's not procreation. It's not heterosexual sex. Otherwise, if that was the case, sterile couples who have no genitals could not get married. Couples that don't have kids or don't have sex would be breaching their contract. Next piece of evidence is the dynamic history of marriage. Why do I say marriage is dynamic as opposed to the static, monolithic type of marriage that B. Messer Phil says marriage is? B. Messer Phil, according to premise 3, marriage is static. It's always been that relationship, A and B, as he described in his syllogism, but that's not the case. Again, you look at marriage from a historical perspective, it is demonstrably true that marriage does change over time. It's not static, it's not monolithic. It changes all the time. Even in our own history, it's changed. Marriage today is radically different than it was 100 years ago. Way different. Back then, you couldn't marry someone of a different race, women didn't have any rights. There were all these differences. And today, it's completely different. Today, it's about love and commitment and fidelity. That's all you need to uphold the contract. You don't need to procreate or have sex. Now there's some confusion by relative. What do I mean by relative? I don't mean something that is outside objective reality. Space and time is relative, according to what Einstein found out, but it's in objective reality. It's just that something that is different from one person to another. Alright, time for you is going to be different than time for me. Yet, it's still objectively the case that what time is for you is what time is for you, regardless of what I think about it. Relative does not mean unobjective or non-objective. Relative can still be objective. So what I mean when marriage is relative, what I mean by that is that marriage does differ from society to society. Sometimes there are just small differences, sometimes there are some major differences. In some societies, polygamy was completely legitimate, recognized. That's what they called marriage, polygamy. Here in the United States, we don't do that. So there's demonstrable evidence that marriage is dynamic and that it is relative. That's why I said in my last video series that marriage is based off of a dynamic, relative ground, not an objective, static ground. The next reason why premise 3 is false is because it assumes that there is a relationship between P and M. P and M. There is no relationship between procreating and marriage. There isn't. Again, go to the marriage contract. Look at history. You don't have to be able to procreate or have kids or even have heterosexual sex to get married. That's not a prerequisite, nor is it a necessary reason. Some people get married just to love each other, just to be committed to each other. That's the reason why. And the last reason why premise 3 is false is because where did marriage come from? Where did marriage come from? Is it really a label we use to describe something in nature? No, it isn't. It is a social institution that we humans invented. It's a complete arbitrary construct, a fabrication. We made it up. Or, governments are something we make up. We make up governments, we make up constitutions. Constitutions don't grow on trees, they don't appear in nature. We create them, we invent them. Same thing is true with marriage. It's just another institution. It's just another human invention. The second mistake is the arbitrary premise. It's false and it's fallacious. So again, we're going to go into variable C here. You can see variable C. So why is it false? Why is it fallacious? Well, first of all, marriage is arbitrary. There's no doubt about that. I've already shown why that's the case when we were going over mistake 1. Next is a false dichotomy. It's not the case that either we have this objective ground where anything goes, or we have any objective ground where anything goes. That's not our only choices. Again, go to my last video, you can see different options. And I also mentioned that those are not necessarily the only options, even though I listed at least 5. So we still have this fallacy of false dichotomy. We also have the fallacy of slippery slope. The implication here is if we allow marriage to be arbitrary, all these horrible things will happen. Incest, you can marry your dog, all this other stuff. But that's a slippery slope argument. He has to provide evidence. Beatmaster must provide evidence if we allow gays to get married or we allow marriage to be arbitrary that these bad things happen. And that's why it's shifting the burden of proof. The next mistake you can see here. And of course, this is an accident. This usually happens with slippery slope. I don't have to prove or provide any objective reasons why they shouldn't. That's not my job. You're claiming that, Beatmaster Phil is claiming that if marriage is arbitrary, these things can go. Well, he has to prove that. I don't have to disprove it in any sense of the word. So this right here, providing objective reason, it's not my job. It's not my task. Consequences that are mentioned here have not happened. Again, marriage is arbitrary. In some countries, in fact many countries, including our own, we don't use this procreation as an objective ground. And that's especially true in states and countries that allow gay marriage. They're not using that objective ground. They're definitely not doing it, according to Beatmaster Phil. Because gays can get married, and that's a direct violation of this dynamic ground. Yet, in those countries, in Massachusetts and now in Maryland, I've yet to see one person marry their dog. I've yet to see someone marry a tree or a chair. I would marry my iMac Mini. But I haven't seen that happen. So these consequences that are being talked about have not happened. And the last part of this mistake is that it looks like a potential is-ought fallacy. The argument seems to be saying, I may be wrong about this particular one, but it seems to be saying that, marriage ought not to be this, it ought to be this other thing, therefore it is this other thing. Well, that's not how reality works, that's not how logic or reason works. The truth does not have to be pretty. The truth can be quite ugly. But I'd rather have an ugly truth than a beautiful lie. Yes, marriage is arbitrary. Yes, those consequences are horrible and they're ugly. But it doesn't mean marriage isn't arbitrary just because we're uncomfortable with something. Mistake number 3. The premise that we need objective ground or else incest, etc. is false. Again, this is more of a sub-mistake from mistake 2. I'm going to specify in a specific part of mistake 2 with mistake number 3. Why is this a false premise? Well, again, it's a false dichotomy. It's not the case that either objective ground or all these other thing happens. But again, there's 2 false dichotomies here, and that's what I want to point out in mistake number 3. No objective ground is needed to stop those actions. Again, you look at these countries and states that have same-sex marriage, they still stop those things without appealing to objective ground. Objective ground is not the only way to avoid those. There are plenty of objective reasons. I'm going to go ahead and just give a few because I don't have time to put a whole lot. But, incest, that's obviously bad for humanity. It has bad consequences. There you go. That's one good reason. Marrying a dog cannot consent. It doesn't know what's happening to it. And it's pretty much pointless because a dog is not going to love you because of marriage. Animals just show affection just because that's the way they are. It's really stupid. Why the hell would you marry a dog? And why the hell would you marry a tree or a chair? What do you get out of it? The idea of marrying a chair is stupid in of itself. We don't need objective ground to know it's a dumb idea. And it's quite silly. Mistake number 4. The exception for sterile couples is ad hoc and petty. So as I suspected, there are some ad hoc